The drilling stopped at a depth of 3,412 meters beneath the Antarctic ice. Dr. Ilya Valeev immediately knew that something was wrong, not in a dangerous sense, not in a way that made him want to run. It was the feeling one gets when opening a door and discovering a room that shouldn't be there. A cold, quiet, impossible sense of wrongness that lived somewhere between excitement and fear, refusing to be either one. He pulled the drill sensor data onto his tablet and read it 3 times. The drill hadn't broken. It hadn't hit bedrock. It had hit something smooth, something perfectly flat, something that registered on the density scanner like no material in any database available to him. He contacted the ground camp via his headset. "Mara," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "Anon, I need you to run the density scan again from your end." There was a short pause. He could hear Mara typing. "It's already running," she said. "I saw it from here. Ilya, what did you hit?" "I don't know," he replied, and it was the most honest answer he had given anyone in 17 days. Excavations at Station Omega 7 began as a continuation of something boring. A set of gravitational anomaly readings, obtained by a deep space scout probe in 2031, had flagged this region for further study. For 3 years, the note sat in the queue behind more urgent scientific projects. Antarctica was cold, and Antarctica was remote. Working there was expensive, but the anomaly wouldn't disappear. It didn't shift or fade as geological anomalies sometimes do. It remained exactly in its place, constant and patient, as if it were waiting to be properly noticed. So, Valeev arrived. He was a xenoarchaeologist by training, a specialty that had become significantly more vibrant since humanity established first contact with 2 separate alien species in the 2000s. Though both species were at roughly the same technological level as Earth, and neither had left anything particularly ancient or mysterious. Most of his career, Valeev studied pre-contact artifacts on Earth, searching for signs that humanity had been visited before those official contacts. He had found very little. He never stopped looking. He was the right man to find what lay beneath the ice. He just didn't know it yet. For the 6 hours following the drilling halt, Valeev and his team of 4 worked cautiously. They widened the shaft, lowered their best sensors, and mapped everything they could reach. By midnight, they had a partial picture. The structure under the ice was massive. Side scans suggested it extended at least 4 kilometers in one direction, possibly further than their instruments could reach. In the other, it was buried under 3,400 meters of accumulated ice, which meant it had been there for a very long time, at least tens of thousands of years, perhaps much longer. The ice above it had formed naturally around it, ruling out recent burial. The surface of the structure was perfectly smooth, no seams, bolts, welds, oxidation, or damage of any kind. Whatever it was made of, it had spent thousands of years under immense pressure and weight in the coldest place on Earth without a single scratch. Valeev sat on an equipment crate in the drilling module at 1 a.m., looking at photos from the deep-bore camera. He had sent everyone else to sleep. He needed to think. He thought better alone. The structure wasn't rock, wasn't ice, wasn't any metal or composite ever produced by humanity. But it was shaped. It was intentional. Every angle was thought out. There were edges that converged with absolute geometric precision. And there, on the outer surface, were marks, engravings. Valeev zoomed into the image until it pixelated, then zoomed in more, as if stubbornness could improve the resolution. The marks were clearly some form of text, a series of symbols arranged in what looked like horizontal rows. He couldn't read them. He had never seen anything like them. But there was a rhythm, a pattern, like all written languages have when you stare at them long enough. He opened a photo editor and began tracing the symbols by hand, enlarging each and comparing it to every known prehistoric script in his database. Proto-Sumerian, Vinca symbols, Indus Valley script, the Dispelio tablet. None matched, but there were echoes. Small structural similarities in the shape of some symbols, as if every human writing system was a distant, simplified relative of whatever this was. He worked all night. By 4:00 a.m., he had traced 17 different symbols and found partial structural overlaps in 6 different ancient human scripts. By 5:30 a.m., he had a working theory, which he knew was almost certainly wrong, but which he couldn't shake. By 6:45 a.m., as the pale gray light of the Antarctic morning pressed against the module windows, he guessed what one line of text might mean. It wasn't a sentence. It was more like a phrase, an instruction, the kind placed at the beginning of something important. He read it aloud, quietly to himself, because that is what archaeologists do when they think they have found something. They speak it into the air and watch. Does it sound like a language? What happened next was something he could never explain in any scientific report. The structure, 3,412 meters below the ice, pulsed, one single deep, vibrational pulse that traveled through the ice, the floor of the drilling module, into the soles of his boots, through his spine, and into the back of his teeth. It lasted perhaps half a second, then it vanished. Every instrument in the module jumped, failed, and rebooted. Valeev sat very still for a very long time. Then, very slowly, he looked at the deep camera video. The marks on the structure's surface were glowing, not brightly, not dramatically, a soft amber light, the color of embers an hour after the fire had gone out, stable, patient, warm. "Oh," he said, to no one in particular, "oh, that is not good." Commander Yara Oye was in the middle of a budget meeting when the first alert arrived. She headed Earth's United Defense Forces, a position that required significantly more paperwork than anyone could have imagined when she applied for it 11 years ago. The budget meeting concerned the maintenance costs for orbital defense stations, and she was mostly paying attention, which could not be said for the three admirals sitting to her left. Her personal communicator rang. She glanced at it. Satellite alert. She dismissed it. Satellite alerts came in dozens of times a day. Most were nothing. It rang again. Another satellite. She frowned. It rang a third time. Third satellite. All three simultaneously now. A triple alert signal she had heard in drills, but never in 10 years of active service had she heard in reality. She stood up and left the meeting without saying a word. The admirals watched her go. One of them reached for his communicator and turned pale. And in the operations center 2 floors down, every screen was active, and every technician was speaking at once. Oye walked to the main display, looked at it, and immediately understood why everyone was talking at once. At the edge of the solar system, past the orbit of Neptune, 40 objects had dropped out of faster-than-light travel in 90 seconds. They were not asteroids, they were not debris, they were ships massive, angular, organized in such precise formation that it could only be military. Each was registered by sensors as heavily armed. Each was broadcasting a signal on a frequency that Earth's contact protocols immediately identified as originating from the Varick Empire. The Varick Empire was not one of the 2 species humanity had established official first contact with. The Varick Empire was something else. Earth's xenodiplomacy teams had been tracking Varick expansion signals for 7 years, watching as they consumed smaller civilizations on the edge of their territory, always moving outward, always closing in. Reports had been filed, concerns had been raised. Nobody had taken them seriously enough. Ships. Oye looked at the count twice. 40. The entire defensive fleet of Earth consisted of 300 vessels, and half of them were in the inner system. "Are they contacting us?" she asked. "No, Commander," the technician closest to her replied. "They are scanning deep electromagnetic fields, mapping us. They aren't announcing themselves." "They're looking around," said Admiral Paddle, who had followed her from the meeting. "Yes," Oye said. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. She didn't panic. She was constitutionally incapable of panicking, which was either a great advantage or a deep character flaw depending on the situation. She wasn't yet sure what situation this was. Her communicator rang again. This time, it was a call from Antarctica, from Dr. Ilya Valeev, the xenoarchaeologist, who was apparently very far from his usual working hours and had filed an emergency research flag 20 minutes ago. She almost dismissed it. She had 40 enemy warships on her screen. What made her answer? The UN Emergency Defense Council gathered within an hour, 22 people in a room designed for 40, because there was no time to find 40. Senator Nama sat at the far end of the table, a thin man with precise hands and a face that had already decided what it thought before anyone spoke a word. Oye laid it out for them in 7 minutes. She showed them the sensor data. She showed them the formation. She showed them the history of the Varick Empire's expansion. 6 civilizations they had consumed in the last 30 years. 2 they simply erased when absorption proved difficult. She softened nothing. 300 ships, Nama said when she finished. Against 40. Yes, Oye replied. Then we have to talk, Nama said. We need to open a channel, and we need to talk to them. and we need to find a way that this doesn't become a military situation. They aren't contacting us, Oye said. They are scanning us. Then we contact them. Senator Oye looked at him directly. Nama, you don't call someone pointing a gun at you and start by asking how they are doing. First, find out what you have in your hands. There was a short silence. What do we have in our hands? Asked one of the other council members. Oye's communicator was already open. That's what I'm going to find out. She contacted Valeev again. He was waiting. He answered before the first full ring. I found something, he said. He was breathing quickly, but his voice was under control. Under the ice. Something very old, very large. And it reacted when He paused. It reacted to me. It's active. It has been active for about 2 hours. The surface is glowing. Dr. Valeev, Oye said carefully, what exactly did you find? I think, he paused again. The sound of his very careful choice of words came through the line. Look, I think I found something that someone buried here a very long time ago. I think they buried it here because they thought that one day they might need it. For what? Oye asked. Valeev looked at the amber glow that was still spreading across the surface of the structure on his video feed. He thought of the line of text he had read aloud. He thought about what it might mean, roughly translated imperfectly from millennia-old script. Exactly that, he said. Then, all communication systems on Earth, every radio, every television, every telephone network, every satellite channel, every emergency broadcast channel transmitted the same sound at the same moment. A voice, calm, deep, and speaking in all languages at once, not sequentially, but all at once, in the way memories arrive, not the way a message is sent. The council chamber went perfectly silent. The voice said, "The enemy has returned. I have waited." 11 words, in 240 languages, all at once, all identical in meaning. Then silence. Everyone in the council chamber looked at Oye. Oye looked at the screen. 40 ships, standing at the edge of the solar system and scanning. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she didn't know, which was significantly more. She thought about the structure, buried under 3,412 meters of Antarctic ice, which by all accounts had existed for thousands of years, and somehow foresaw this exact moment so well that it buried itself there and waited for it. Whatever it was, it didn't ask for permission out of weakness. Firstly, it asked for permission because it was created by humans, and it knew that humans had to be asked. She thought about all this in perhaps 4 seconds. Then she said the only thing she could honestly say. Not yet. The voice didn't answer. But the amber light on Valeev's camera feed, 3,412 meters under the Antarctic ice, pulsed softly, warmly, as if it had heard her, as if it approved, and it waited, because whatever it was created for, it was very, very good at waiting. In the outer solar system, the Varric fleet completed its initial scan of the third planet and began to move slowly, methodically inward, like a hand moving towards something it already knows it is going to take. Arch-Admiral Sot stood on the bridge of the Eternal Superiority and watched the blue planet grow on the tactical display. He had been told it was a primitive world, an insignificant civilization, a footnote in the history of expansion. He saw nothing to suggest otherwise. He was the best military commander the Varric Empire had produced in 3 centuries. He had absorbed 11 civilizations and erased 2. He had never lost a campaign. He hadn't even come close. He looked at the blue planet, with its tiny fleet of defensive ships and 1 large moon and cluttered orbital stations, and felt something he rarely felt. He felt boredom. He told his adjutant to begin drafting a standard absorption offer. 48 hours for a response. 2 options, surrender or erasure. He had already given this speech, and he would give it again to the next world after this, and the next world after that. He didn't notice that 17 of his long-range sensor posts, positioned in the outer system for navigation and communication relay, had gone silent in the last 2 hours. Equipment sometimes failed. It wasn't worth his attention. He didn't know, as he looked at the blue planet on his screen, that something under the ice had been listening to the sound of his engines since the moment his fleet dropped out of FTL. Something old, something patient, something that had spent 2,000 years doing nothing but thinking, and that in the 90 seconds it took for his fleet to arrive, it had already begun. He didn't know. He would learn. The lift didn't exist 24 hours ago, and it was the first thing Valeev noticed when the drill crew widened the shaft enough for a human to descend. At some point in the night, While the amber light spread across the structure's surface and all the instruments in the module showed impossible numbers, a panel on the structure's outer skin opened cleanly, silently, as if it were always meant to open. Inside the panel was a vertical shaft, and inside the shaft, what unmistakably functioned as an elevator platform. It waited for someone to go down. Valeev went down alone. The rest of his team stood at the top of the drill shaft and watched the platform descend until the amber light consumed him and he disappeared from view. The descent took 4 minutes. He counted his breaths to stay calm. In those 4 minutes, he experienced 17 different feelings and decided not to focus on any of them, which was a skill he had developed over 20 years of working in places where humans shouldn't be. The platform stopped, the doors, and they were doors, smooth and perfectly fitted. Like all other surfaces of the structure, opened without a sound. What Ilya Valeev stepped into was not a room, it was a city. The interior of the structure stretched further than any underground space he had ever seen. The ceiling was 40 meters above him, curving in a long arc that caught the amber light and distributed it evenly, so that nothing inside cast a sharp shadow. The floor was smooth and clean and slightly warm beneath his boots, as if the material itself generated soft heat, and the space stretched in all directions. Corridors diverging to the left and right, open halls filled with what looked like workstations, rows of what might have been storage containers, each the size of a small car, and behind them, forms too large and too complex to be understood at a glance. Everything was lit with amber. Everything was warm. Everything was absolutely clean. Not sterile like a hospital, but clean like very old, very well-made things, because the years had passed them by without leaving a mark. He stood at the entrance and just looked for a long time. He had found important things before. Ancient pottery, stone tablets, ruins of buildings that predated known civilization by thousands of years. None of that prepared him for this. And this wasn't a ruin. It wasn't the remains of something. It was something that was just waiting completely intact, completely functional for however much time had passed since it was last used. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Dr. Valeev," said a voice right next to him. He didn't flinch. He was proud of that. His heart rate doubled for about 5 seconds, then returned to normal, and he turned to see what was speaking. There was nothing there, no speaker, no screen, no visible source of the voice. "I apologize," the voice said. It was calm and measured, neither warm nor cold. Like a river that is neither warm nor cold, it just flows. "I didn't mean to scare you. I haven't spoken to a human in a very long time, and I am calibrating." "Calibrating what?" Valeev asked. "Ah, my sensitivity to volume, to how close to stand, in a sense. When you don't speak to anyone for 2,000 years, you lose a certain sense of proper presence." Valeev looked at the empty space next to him. 2,000 years, he said, approximating. "Time is not something I measure carefully during hibernation. My internal chronometer shows 1,983 years, 6 months, and several days. But I have learned not to trust my internal chronometer over the centuries." "What are you?" Valeev asked. It was the simplest question he could find. "I am what your ancestors made," the voice replied. "I am a solution that was decided upon a very long time ago by people who had no other choice. They built me because they were losing. They finished me because they were in despair. We sealed me here when the war ended because they hoped they would never need me again." "What war?" Valeev said. There was a short pause. "Come," said the voice. "There is much to tell you, and the people on the surface will want to hear it too." Commander Yara Oye arrived at Station Omega 7, 14 hours after Valeev descended into the structure. She arrived on a military transport with a security team of 12, 2 communications specialists, and Admiral Patel, who hadn't slept and looked the part. The UN Council had spent most of the night arguing. Senator Nama had spent most of the night drafting a surrender proposal. Oye had spent most of the night reading everything she could find on the Varick Empire, which was not as much as she would have liked. She descended in the lift alone. She ordered the security team to stay at the top. They didn't like it. She didn't particularly care if they liked it. The voice had told Valeev that his name was simply Voice, that he admitted it wasn't much of a name, but the most accurate description of what he was. Oye was speaking to him as she stepped off the platform. He spoke to her the same way he had spoken to Valeev, directly and without pretense. And he told her what he had told him. The story took 2 hours. Oye listened without interrupting, as she always listened to what was important. The war began 2011 years ago. The people who started it were not called the Varick Empire. Back then, they called themselves the Velshar, which translated roughly to the chosen continuation. They had been expanding through the galaxy for 600 years before they found Earth's solar system, absorbing or destroying every civilization they encountered. They weren't cruel for pleasure. They simply adhered to a philosophy that stated the galaxy had a natural hierarchy, that they were at its peak, and that everything below them was either useful or in the way. Humanity at the time was a young interstellar race. They had colonized 4 worlds beyond Earth. They had established contact with 3 other civilizations, all small, all peaceful. They were, by any galactic standard, unremarkable. The Velshar arrived and offered the standard proposal: surrender and be absorbed, or refute and be erased. They offered this because they offered it to everyone, and everything either surrendered or was small enough to be erased quickly. Humanity refused. This, by all reasonable analysis, was a catastrophic mistake. The Velshar were 20 times larger than humanity in fleet strength. They were better armed, better organized, and had a century of practice in this particular kind of war. Human resistance scattered, desperate, often poorly coordinated, should have lasted perhaps 3 years. It lasted 63. Why did it last so long? Oy asked. Because of what you are, the voice said simply. Human beings under threat of total annihilation behave differently than most species. Most species, in the face of total annihilation, break into 2 groups: those who fight and those who surrender. The fighters eventually get tired. The surrenderers make deals. The invader wins. And that is the pattern. It is always the pattern. But humans didn't follow it. Humans followed it partially. There were those who surrendered. There were those who fought. But there was also a 3rd group, which other species did not reliably produce in the Velshar experience. The voice paused. Those who displayed ingenuity. Over 63 years of war, humanity lost 11,000 cities and 7 billion people. The numbers were almost unfathomable. The losses were intentionally buried in the historical record, softened by generations into vague mentions of the Great Silence, and eventually almost entirely forgotten, partly from grief, partly from a cultural decision made by the surviving generation that some things were too heavy to carry into a future that desperately needed belief in itself. But over those 63 years, humanity also did something the Velshar never expected. They innovated in real time, adapting tactics mid-campaign that no military doctrine covered. They turned civil infrastructure into weapons. They forged alliances with species the Velshar had already conquered, infiltrating occupied territories and organizing resistance from within. Above all, they refused to stop. And then, Valeev said, sitting quietly in the corner, listening to the story again, and then they built me, said the voice. The voice was not a weapon in the traditional sense. Oy had expected some kind of tool, something planetary, capable of firing at a fleet from the surface. She was wrong. The voice was a strategic intelligence, or the most advanced ever built by any species in any era of recorded history. It was designed to process the entire picture of a military conflict, every ship position, every supply line, every communication path, every decision-making pattern of a commander simultaneously, in real time, and to find in that form the thread that, when pulled, would lead to the collapse of everything else. Not to destroy, not to blow things into wreckage, but to untangle, said the voice. Like untangling a knot, not by cutting it, but by understanding it. In the old war, the voice said, the final battle lasted 8 hours. The Velshar fleet at the time numbered 60,000 ships. I started working as soon as the battle began. I didn't fire a single weapon from the human fleet's arsenal. I redirected their communications, and when I introduced navigational errors into their formation, I fed false orders through their chain of command. I found 17 people throughout their entire military structure on whom all other decisions depended, and I ensured those 17 people received incorrect information at exactly the right time. In 8 hours, Oy said, in 8 hours a fleet of 60,000 ships was in total disarray. They stopped fighting their enemies and began fighting each other by mistake. Their supply lines were tangled beyond immediate repair. Their command structure made 3 catastrophic strategic errors based on information I arranged for them to receive. By the 7th hour, they were retreating. By the 8th hour, they were fleeing. And they never came back, Valeev said. They never came back, the voice confirmed. They went home, They recovered. Over centuries, the memory of what happened here faded. Culture changed. Names changed. Philosophy changed somewhat, though not as much. And eventually, a new generation of commanders decided that what made their ancestors fear this particular solar system was likely superstition. Oye was silent. "And now they are here," she said. "And now they are here," the voice said. The Varric ultimatum arrived at 14 Earth Standard Time, broadcast on all frequencies, in clear and usable standard galactic that translation systems handled without trouble. It was straightforward. Earth had 48 hours to begin surrender procedures. A delegation would be received at a point in orbit designated by the Varric command. All warships were to be brought to combat readiness, moved to the far side of the moon. All orbital stations were to open for inspection. All planetary governments were to submit to administrative authority, imperial administration, starting from the moment of signing. If these conditions were not met within 48 hours, the fleet would begin a systematic reduction of Earth's defensive potential, followed by orbital bombardment of population centers sufficient to demonstrate the cost of resistance. Nama read it in the council chamber and immediately started taking notes. Oye looked at him across the table and said nothing. "We must respond," Nama said. "We must open a channel. We must let them know we are ready to negotiate." "We are not ready to negotiate," Oye said. "Commander, 300 ships. I know how many ships we have." Senator Oye looked at him directly. "And I know how many they have. That is why I went to Antarctica this morning." She sat in the room, writing letters. She brought the communication channel with the voice up on the main screen. The council watched in silence as she told them about what she had learned, what the structure was, what it had done before, what it was offering to do now. Nama's face went through several expressions quickly. "It's a machine," he said finally. "An automated weapon system from a millennium ago. We have no idea if it even works anymore, or if it ever worked, or if the history it told Dr. Valeev is true. We cannot bet the planet on a machine that woke up this morning." "It didn't wake up this morning," Oye said. "It woke up when it was asked. There is a difference. It could still be lying. It could still be malfunctioning. We could activate it, and it might do nothing. And then we have told 40 warships to go to hell." Oye looked at the video from Antarctica. The amber light. Patient, warm, impossible amber light. "Yes," she said. "We could." She went back to Antarctica that day. She stood in the huge, warm interior of the structure and looked at its arch-like amber ceiling and felt for a moment the full weight of what she was about to do. "Voice," she said. "I need to know one thing. Yes, can you win?" the voice asked. A pause. A short pause, perhaps 2 seconds, but long enough to feel it was deliberated. "I am automated." "Commander Oye," the voice said. "I have been studying the Varric fleet for 14 hours. Their formation, their communication signatures, the logic of their supply chain, their command hierarchy. I have already identified 43 critical nodes in their operational structure. 6 of them I started eliminating 3 hours ago." Oye stared. "You already started?" "I started. As soon as they arrived," the voice said calmly. "I didn't attack. I just started listening, learning, and making very small adjustments. The Admiral doesn't know yet that anything is wrong. And he will know," the voice said. "But by the time he knows, the shape of the problem he faces will be very different from the one he thinks he arrived here to solve." Oye stood in the amber light and thought about this. Around her, the massive interior of the structure hummed quietly, not with mechanical noise, but with something more subtle, the sound of something very large, very hard at work thinking. "Don't do anything catastrophic without asking me first," she said. "Of course," the voice said. "I mean, I know you do. That is why your ancestors built me to require authorization." A short pause. They were very wise people. In the outer solar system, Arch-Admiral Sot was reviewing the scan results of his intelligence officers when his communications chief entered the bridge with a message that 31 long-range sensor posts had gone offline in the last 6 hours. Sot looked at the report. 31 was more than 17. It was still technically equipment failure. His fleet was huge. Equipment failed. "Run a diagnostic on the relay network," he said. "Already running, Admiral. Results in 2 hours." "Good." He returned to the scan results. The planet was small and unprepared, and its military resistance would be trivially easy to neutralize. He had done this 11 times before. There was a process. There was a sequence. The process and sequence worked. He had 48 hours on the clock. He wasn't worried. He didn't notice that 14 more posts went dark while he was speaking to his communications chief. He didn't notice that the navigational time signals his outer formation relied on had shifted by a millisecond. Too small to register as an error, but enough to introduce tiny discrepancies in the position data of 300 ships over the next few hours. He didn't notice any of this. And in the amber warmth beneath the Antarctic ice, the voice noted that he hadn't noticed and made a quiet entry in its operational log and moved on to the next 43 things on its list. The silence began in the outer system and permeated inward like a tide coming in at night, so slowly that no one noticed the rising water until it reached their knees. Arch-Admiral Sot had served in the Varric army for 31 years, and he had a commander's ear for silence. He knew the difference between the silence of a system at rest and the silence of a system that had stopped. The first kind was normal. The second kind meant something had gone wrong. By the morning of the second day, 30 hours after his fleet arrived in Earth's solar system, Sot began to hear the second kind of silence, where he expected the first. It started with the sensor posts. Now there were 45, dark and unresponsive. The diagnostic he had ordered from his communications chief yielded no useful results. The posts simply weren't transmitting a signal for no apparent reason. The hardware seemed intact, based on the last known readings before each one went quiet. There was no wreckage, no impact traces, no electromagnetic events that could explain the failure. They just stopped, one after the other, as if something had passed silently among them in the dark and turned them off with one finger. His chief engineer said it was a cascading power failure spreading through a shared firmware version. Sot accepted this explanation the way a man accepts an explanation he doesn't believe but cannot immediately disprove. Then the ships in the outer formation began to stop responding. It started with one ship, the Ketvor, a destroyer stationed on the far edge of the left flank of the formation. A standard patrol task. It missed its scheduled check-in at 7. The fleet communications officer noted this and sent a repeat signal. No response. He sent another. Nothing. He noted it for later follow-up and moved to the next item on his log. At 9, 2 more ships missed their check-in. Both on the outer edges of the formation, both didn't respond to repeat signals. The communications officer reported this to the bridge. Sot sent a courier ship to the Ketvor for visual contact and to determine the problem. The courier ship didn't return. He sent 3 more courier ships, one to each of the 3 non-responding ships. He gave them a maximum turnaround time of 4 hours and ordered them to return regardless of what they found. None of them returned. The silence spread through the outer formation over the next 6 hours like a slow stain. Ships that had been communicating reliably just stopped, not all at once, not in groups, but 1 or 2 at a time, irregularly. So each individual instance could look like a coincidence until you looked at them all together and saw that the pattern was not random. The pattern was systematic. The pattern was moving inward. By midday, 400 ships in the outer ring were not responding to any calls on any frequencies. Sot stood at his tactical display and looked at the map of his fleet with 400 gray markers where there should have been 400 green markers, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. "Are they destroyed?" he asked his tactical officer. "We cannot determine that without visual contact, Admiral. There are no explosion signatures, no debris clouds, no distress signals. They just aren't on communication on passive long-range sensors. Most of them seem to their mass signatures appear to match intact ships, but their engine signatures are cold or reduced. They might be drifting. 1,000 ships don't just drift," Sot said. "No, Admiral, they aren't drifting." He ordered the inner formation to tighten. He pulled the middle ring ships close and reorganized the command structure around his main fleet. He sent fighters, scouts in small groups to the outer ring with orders to establish visual contact with the nearest unresponsive ships and return before proceeding further. 8 of the 12 reconnaissance groups didn't return. The 4 groups that did return reported something that made no military sense. The outer ring ships they reached were undamaged. No damage, no hull breaches, no fires, no bodies floating in space. The ships were just sitting cold and motionless. Their crews were inside but not responding to calls. Their systems were operating on minimal power. Their navigation computers were locked on courses that didn't match any assigned course. One reconnaissance group managed to dock with an unresponsive destroyer, and the boarding party found the crew at their stations. Alive, unharmed, completely unresponsive, sitting in their chairs, eyes open, breathing, but not reacting to anything around them. Not sleeping, not dead, just somewhere else. The boarding party reported this, and then they too went silent. In Antarctica, the voice explained itself to Ilya and Valeev in the same calm, level tone it used for everything. The method is not complicated, it said. Every military force is a machine. Like any machine, it depends on how its parts work together. Remove the communication between the parts, and the machine doesn't break. It just stops acting as a unified whole. It becomes a collection of individual parts, each confused by what the others are doing. "What did you do to the crews?" Ilya asked. The boarding party report said they were unresponsive. "I changed the frequency output of the ship's internal communication system. A specific frequency I use temporarily disrupts certain, clears throat, neurological signaling processes. It is not harmful. It passes within 12 hours without any long-term consequences. I chose it intentionally because I didn't want to kill anyone." Ilya stared at the empty space where the voice came from. "You can do that?" "Yes. You chose not to kill them, Commander," the voice said, with something that was closer to patience than a 2,000-year-old creature could have. "I was created to win wars, not to fill space with corpses. The goal is to eliminate the threat. The goal is not to demonstrate how many things I can destroy. Those are very different goals, and I would appreciate it if the people in this room could remember what I was designed for." Ilya was silent. "Understood," she said. 400 ships in the outer ring are now effectively neutralized, the voice continued. "They are undamaged, their crews will recover, and they cannot be used as a fighting force without significant time and effort to reorganize and repair their systems. That leaves roughly 39,600 ships in the main body of the fleet." 39,600, Valeev muttered. "Yes, I also introduced navigational timing discrepancies in about 800 ships in the middle formation. These ships currently believe they are in the correct positions, but their position data is slightly offset. Over the next 4 hours, this will lead to them drifting out of effective command coordination range. They won't know it's happening until they are already separated." "How do you do all this at the same time?" Valeev asked. He sat with a notepad on his lap, writing. "Why?" "Because I am not doing all this at the same time," the voice said. "I am doing it sequentially, but the sequence is very fast. I can process the entire communication landscape of a 400 ship fleet simultaneously and identify intervention points in about 8 minutes. Executing the interventions takes longer because each one must be synchronized relative to the others to avoid triggering alarm signals. But the planning is effectively instantaneous. What about the main body of the fleet?" Ilya asked. "The core around the flagship." "I am working on it," the voice said simply. "These things take time to do correctly. If I move too quickly, the Admiral will notice the pattern and adapt. I prefer that he notices things one at a time. Too late to respond effectively to each one." Senator Nama arrived at Station Omega, 7 on a military transport at 17. He arrived with 3 of his staff and a clear plan. He had been trying to open a diplomatic channel with the Varric fleet since the ultimatum arrived, and he was furious that Ilya hadn't authorized it. He found Ilya in the drilling module above the structure, looking at the deep camera video, and told her everything. "I thought you were risking every life on this planet," he said. "Every hour we wait is an hour closer to that fleet opening fire. We must talk to them. We must let them know we are ready to negotiate." "And what will we offer them to negotiate?" Ilya asked without turning around. "Our cooperation, our resources, our consent to some form of controlled integration." "Controlled integration?" Ilya said. "You mean absorption? I mean survival, Senator." Ilya turned to him. Her voice was not raised, it never was. 3 hours ago, the Varric fleet had 40,000 operational warships. Right now, there are roughly 39,200. In 8 hours, there will be significantly fewer. The shape of this situation is changing. I would like to give it a little more time to change before we walk into negotiations empty-handed. Nama stared at her. "You are saying that this machine down there really works. I am saying that 400 enemy ships are sitting cold and empty in the outer solar system right now, and the Varric commander doesn't know why yet." There was a long silence. "Show me," Nama said. She showed him. Valeev guided him through the interior of the structure, and the voice spoke to him as it had to everyone else, directly and without pretense. Nama was a politician, and politicians knew how to hide what they felt. But Valeev watched his face closely. and saw the sequence of emotions passing over it. Disbelief, then reluctant acceptance, then a new and different kind of fear, which was the fear of a man who was sure of something, and then that certainty was taken away. If it can do all of this, Nama said slowly, standing in the middle of the huge, amber-lit interior, then the Variks will eventually have to realize what is happening, and when they realize, they will react. You can't take apart a fleet of that size without them noticing. I am counting on them noticing, the voice said. Nama turned to the voice, the reflex, as if there were nothing to turn to. Explain what the Admiral will notice when enough of his fleet stops responding. He won't understand what is causing it. He will try conventional reactions, send scouts, reinforce the formation, increase communication security. None of that will help, because the problem isn't his security. It's in the assumptions on which all his command is built. He assumes he is the only rational actor in the system. He assumes the only threats are the ones he sees. When conventional reactions don't help, his fear will drive him to dramatic action. What dramatic action? Nama asked. He has a planetary siege cannon on the flagship, the voice said. A main gun capable of generating a directed energy beam at 60% of the speed of light. I expect him to use it on Earth sometime in the next 12 to 16 hours. Everyone in the room froze. And you will stop him? Oye asked carefully. I have already positioned a captured Varik relay station on the beam's trajectory, the voice said. I have been maneuvering it there for the last 6 hours, using its own automated docking systems. The Admiral still believes the station is under his control. He will fire his cannon. The beam will reach what he was aiming at. It just won't be Earth. Nama sat down heavily on a piece of equipment. He was not a man who sat down unexpectedly. Valeev took a note. You planned this even before he decided to fire, Valeev said. He hadn't decided when I started, the voice agreed. But I saw what he was going to do. The fear patterns in his decision-making were consistent with a commander who has exhausted rational options and will turn to something dramatic. Dramatic actions are what scared commanders use to feel in control of a situation they are losing. Oye looked at the voice with an expression Valeev couldn't fully read. It wasn't quite admiration. It was something more complex than admiration. Have you done this before? She asked. Yes, the voice said. I have. The siege cannon fired at 23:47 Earth Standard Time. Sot had spent 6 hours watching his fleet fall apart in a way he couldn't explain or stop. And when the diagnostic reports stopped making sense, and the formation reports stopped being reassuring, and the number of dark markers on his tactical map exceeded 1,000 and kept growing, he did what the voice had predicted he would do. He called up the siege cannon's targeting system, aimed it at Earth, and ordered the weapons officer to fire. The beam was blinding. Even from the distance of the outer system, it was visible from the night side of Earth as a straight, pale line drawn across the stars. It reached its target in less than a second, a statement made in the language of raw physical force, which said, I am still here, and I am still dangerous, and you should fear me. Sot watched the targeting confirmation screen, waiting for impact readings that would show him that at least something had gone as he intended. Instead, he received an emergency proximity alert. One of his own relay stations, Relay Station 12, positioned to support long-range communication in the inner system, was directly on the beam's trajectory. The beam had already reached it. The station didn't explode dramatically. The directed energy beam simply hit it, and the station stopped being a station and became a very short, very bright cloud of expanding particles. And then, after a few seconds, nothing. The weapons officer stared at his console. Admiral, he said, we lost Relay Station 12. I see that, Sot said. His voice was very quiet. The targeting solution had been correct. Earth should have been on the beam's trajectory. The station wasn't there yesterday, Sot said. He stood at the tactical display and looked at the place where his relay station had been. It had shifted. His own relay station had shifted into exactly the right place to intercept his own weapon. His own station, under his own automated fleet systems, which he had trusted completely, had shifted perfectly into the line of fire while he wasn't looking, as if the universe itself had reached out and placed it there. He stood there for a long time. His bridge crew was very quiet. That kind of silence arises when experienced military professionals realize they don't fully understand the nature of the situation they are in. Finally, Sot said, "Open a channel to Earth." His communications officer looked up. "Sir, standard greeting protocol?" "Not to their government," Sot said. "Not to their military. To the thing that is doing this to us. He looked at the tactical display, the dark markers, the drifting ships, the relay station his own cannon had destroyed. Whatever is doing this to us, I want to talk to it. The channel opened, and the voice answered. The channel opened, and for a moment, there was nothing, only the faint background radiation of deep space and the quiet sound of men and women on both ends of the line holding their breath. Then the voice said, "Arch Admiral Sot, I have been expecting your call." Sot stood in the center of his bridge. Every officer at every station froze. No one touched their consoles. The room was filled with the silence of held breath. The specific silence of people who know something is happening for which they have no framework. "Who am I speaking to?" Sot asked. "You are speaking to the reason your ancestors placed a warning flag on your navigational charts 2,000 years ago," the voice said. "The reason they designated this solar system as forbidden and left a mark there for 20 centuries without explanation. I am the explanation. On Earth, in the Antarctic structure." Oye stood, listening to the communication channel. Valeev was beside her, taking notes. Nama was also present, sitting in the corner very quietly. "You are not human," Sot said. "I am a product of humans," the voice said. "I am what humans make when they are pushed far enough and need to think clearly, quickly, and accurately about a very large problem. They built me to think about those kinds of problems, so they didn't have to think about them alone." Sot folded his hands behind his back, being a proud and precise man, and processed the complex information, standing very straight. "Are you an artificial intelligence?" "That is one of the words for what I am," the voice said. "A more accurate description might be a very long solution. Your fleet has been in this system for 38 hours. During this time, roughly 1,400 of your ships are no longer effective combat units. Not destroyed, redirected, separated, tangled. The crew of each is alive. That was a choice I made intentionally." "Why intentionally?" Sot asked. "If you can do this, why not just destroy us?" There was a short pause, not a computational pause, but a deliberate one. "Because the goal," the voice said, "is not to fill space with the wreckage of your ships. The goal is to let you understand that this particular path leads nowhere. Destruction achieves that message once, and then it is over. What I am doing instead leaves you the possibility to go home and tell your emperor what you found here. That is worth significantly more than a field of wreckage." Sot was silent. Behind him, his communications officer looked at the channel with wide eyes. His tactical officer looked at the dark markers on the tactical display. "How many of my ships have you neutralized?" Sot asked. "Neutralized is not quite the right word," the voice said. "Currently, 2,100 ships are out of effective command coordination range. Approximately 600 more are experiencing navigational discrepancies that will become evident to their crews over the next few hours. The crews of these vessels are unharmed. The ships themselves are undamaged. They are simply not where you think, or are incapable of acting as part of your fleet in their current state." 2,700 ships, Sot said. "Yes, in 38 hours, yes." The admiral stood motionless for a long time. "What are you waiting for? Why not just finish it?" "Because," the voice said, "I would like to talk first, and because I think if you are willing to listen rather than react, this conversation could change the nature of the situation you think you are in." Sot looked at his tactical display. He had lost a relay station to his own cannon. He had lost communication with 2,700 ships without a single visible enemy. He had sent couriers and none returned. He had run diagnostics and found no explanations. He had done everything he had been taught in 31 years of military training, and none of it had worked. And the voice on the other end of the channel was speaking to him with the calm, unhurried patience of something that hadn't even broken a sweat. "Speak," he said. "You know," the voice said, "why your navigational doctrine has a forbidden zone around this solar system historically." "Superstition," Sot said. "The flag was added by a previous administration. The reason was lost. We assumed it was irrational. It was added by your ancestors," the voice said. "The civilization you call the founders of the first expansion, those whom your culture remembers as the Velshar. It was added after the last Varic fleet arrived in the solar system." A pause from Sot. "The Velshar were a different people," he said carefully. "Different culture, different philosophy. Our historians acknowledge a line of succession, but not identity. Your historians acknowledge what is convenient," the voice said. "Not maliciously, just accurately. The Velshar arrived in the solar system in the 10th year of their expansionist campaign. They offered the inhabitants of this planet the same proposal that your people offered them 48 hours ago: surrender or erasure. The inhabitants of this planet refused. We know the myth, Sot said. It is not a myth. The inhabitants of this planet refused, and they fought, and they lost 7 billion of their people in battle. And they didn't stop, not in the first year, not in the 20th year, not in the 50th year. They didn't stop because they aren't built to stop. That is what your ancestors didn't understand about this species, and it cost them dearly. And that is what you didn't understand when you came here. They eventually stopped, Sot said. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. They stopped because they built me, the voice said. And I ended the war in 8 hours. And your ancestors. The Velshar fleet in that battle. They turned around, fled, went home, and never came back. For 2,000 years, they put a flag on their maps. And eventually, the reason was forgotten. But the flag remained, because somewhere in the deep record of their navigational doctrine, someone knew what later generations didn't. Sot said nothing. That flag was the last honest act your ancestors committed in this part of the galaxy, the voice said. It was a message to the future that said, whatever you do, don't go here. It lasted 2,000 years. You ignored it. On Earth, Oye was very quiet. She listened to things she hadn't expected to hear. Not just strategy, not just containment, but something that sounded very much like grief, as if the voice wasn't just advocating for survival, but was genuinely mourning the waste that led to this moment. She hadn't expected a machine to be capable of grief. She began to wonder if she had misunderstood what the voice was. Do you want me to be afraid? Sot said. I want you to be accurate, the voice said. Fear is the correct reaction to an accurate assessment of your position. It is not weakness, it is information. Your ancestors feared this solar system, and they were right to fear it. Fear kept your people away for 2,000 years and kept your people alive for 2,000 years. Ignoring it cost you 2,700 ships in 38 hours without a single exchange of conventional fire. If I send a retreat signal, Sot said, my emperor will ask me what I found here. Yes, the voice said, and you will tell him the truth, that a primitive world on the edge of the expansion zone is not primitive, that it is protected by what? By something that doesn't fight by the rules your military doctrine covers, that the flag on the navigational charts is not superstition, it is a standing warning from people who already learned this lesson. He won't believe me. Then show him the recording of this conversation, the voice said. Show him the sensor logs. Show him the 2,700 ships you can't explain. Show him what I did with your own cannon. A long, flat silence followed. Why? Sot asked slowly. You are telling me to leave? If you can do what you think you can do, if you can take apart this fleet ship by ship, why not just do it? Why negotiate? Why leave us the possibility of retreat? The voice paused a real, long pause. Because, the voice said finally, this planet already lost 7 billion people in a war with your ancestors. The generation that survived that war made a decision. They buried me here. They sealed me under the ice. They didn't keep me active and aimed at the sky. They decided to forget the war, which was perhaps unwise, but they decided it because they wanted to build something aimed forward. They wanted to be a species that builds, not a species that spends its energy waiting for the next enemy. And yet, here you are, Sot said. And yet, here I am, because they were wise enough to understand that the desire for peace is not the same as security. They buried me here as a promise to themselves. If this ever returns, we will be ready. Not seeking, not waiting for a chance to fight, but ready. Pause. I would prefer not to prove this readiness. By filling your entire fleet with corpses, Admiral, I would prefer that your Emperor receives a clear report and updates his navigational charts, and that this system remains on the list of places the Varick Empire does not go. That is the end I seek. Another end is available, but I don't want it. The channel had been open for 51 minutes when Senator Nama made a mistake. He had been sitting in the corner of the Antarctic structure, listening, and as the conversation continued, his thinking changed. He had arrived in Antarctica believing the voice was a reckless gamble. He had started to reluctantly believe it might work, but his instincts as a diplomat were still operating, and his instincts told him that a parallel channel, a human diplomatic channel working alongside this conversation, could only help. More options were always better. He moved away from Ilya and Valeev and quietly called on his personal communicator to a frequency his diplomatic staff had flagged as the Varric fleet's secondary channel. He told them he was a high-level representative of Earth and that he was ready to discuss terms regardless of what was happening on the main channel. The Varric intelligence officer who answered was very professional and very fast. In less than 2 minutes, he had received 3 things from Nama: his name, his location, and confirmation that the source of the Varric fleet's disruption was underground in the Antarctica region. If Nama didn't realize what he had done until 20 seconds after the call ended, when his own communicator showed him that the call had been recorded and that his location data had been transmitted to the Varric fleet network, he looked up. Ilya was already watching him. She hadn't heard the call, but she saw how his face had changed. "What did you do?" she said. "It wasn't a question. I was trying." He stopped. "I told them where we are." Ilya looked at him for a long moment. Her expression didn't change. She turned to the air above her. "Voice," she said. "Nama gave them our location." "Yes," the voice said. "I know." The signal was immediately intercepted. Pause. "The Admiral has now ended our conversation. He has ordered a coordinated planetary bombardment aimed at this region. Every ship in effective firing range has been given a targeting solution for Antarctica." Ilya stared straight ahead. How many ships are in effective firing range for an orbital bombardment of this nature, given the current positions of the fleet? "Approximately 230. Valeev put down his notepad. "They are going to fire everything they have." "At us," Nama said. His voice had gone empty. "Yes," the voice said. "They are going to. It is the desperate step I predicted. When a commander cannot win by conventional means, he tries to destroy the source of his problem directly. The Admiral decided that destroying me is worth any cost." "Can you stop 230 ships firing simultaneously?" Ilya asked. "I cannot stop the firing," the voice said. "The shots are already authorized. The targeting solutions are already locked." A short pause. "But I don't need to stop the firing. I only need to not be here when it arrives." Ilya blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," the voice said, with something in its tone that wasn't quite warmth but was something in that direction, "that the structure you are standing in is not as deep underground as the Varric Empire believes. The Antarctic base was a cradle, a place of sleep. It was designed to keep me in hibernation for as long as possible. I was in hibernation for 2,000 years. I am no longer in hibernation." The amber light around them shifted. It became something more alive, softly pulsating, like light pulsing in very deep water when something large moves below. "Hold on to something," the voice said. "If you feel comfortable." Valeev grabbed the nearest piece of equipment with both hands, and outside over Antarctica, 230 directed energy beams struck the ice, rock, and ground beneath it in a coordinated barrage that lasted 11 seconds and generated enough heat to instantly vaporize everything within a radius of 2 kilometers. When the beam stopped, the light went out, and smoke and steam rose from the empty crater that had been Station Omega 7. There was nothing there. No structure, no people, no amber light. Only a clean glass plane where the ice had been. On board the Eternal Superiority, SOT confirmed the strike. "Direct hits confirmed on all target coordinates," she said. "Structure destroyed." SOT nodded slowly. He looked at the targeting screen. The readings were clean. Total structural destruction. Whatever was under the ice, it is no longer under the ice. He exhaled. "Good," he said. "Begin fleet reorganization." "Admiral." The communications officer's voice was strange. "Careful." SOT turned. "We are receiving a signal from 230 ships simultaneously. The same message from every targeting system in the fleet, in the same format, in the same writing." He looked up. "It is not a script our linguists know." SOT walked to the switchboard and looked at the message. He couldn't read the script, but he didn't need to read it to understand what had happened. He didn't need to translate the message to understand what it meant. When 230 targeting systems displayed the same unknown text simultaneously, he called his chief linguist. The linguist arrived in 4 minutes, looked at the script, and said something SOT would think about for the rest of his life. "Admiral," the linguist said, "this is related to the form of writing our team has been studying for years. It appears to be an ancestor of several early human writing systems, very old, very formal." He looked up. "I can only give you a rough translation, but I believe it says, 'You aimed at me. Now I know where you all are.'" The bridge was perfectly silent. SOT looked at the tactical display, the dark markers, the scattered fleet, The relay station his own cannon had destroyed, the empty crater in the ice. He thought about the voice on the channel, patient and calm and completely without anger. The voice that had said, "I don't want an ending with all corpses." He thought about the fact that, to whomever that voice belonged, it was no longer under the ice. And Arch-Admiral Sot, a 1-year veteran of the Varick Imperial Fleet, undefeated in 11 campaigns, the best military mind his people had produced in 3 centuries, felt something sit in the center of his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Real fear, not the fear of a man who might lose. The fear of a man who had just completely realized that the situation he was in was not at all what he thought. "Find me all the long-range sensors we have," he said quietly. "Everything. Scan the entire system." They scanned. They found nothing. The silence that answered them was the most frightening silence any of them had ever heard. Somewhere in the solar system, moving in a way no Varick sensor could calibrate, the voice moved through the darkness between the planets and watched the fleet and planned the next 47 things that were going to happen. It was not in a hurry. It had not been in a hurry for 2,000 years. It was not going to start now. The first thing Oye did when she realized she was still alive was inhale. The second thing she did was look around. She was in the same amber interior she had been standing in when the voice told them to hold on. The walls were the same, the ceiling was the same. The floor was still warm beneath her boots. Valeev was in the trim to her left, holding tightly to a console with both hands, blinking at the space around him like a man blinks when he expected to die and discovered he hadn't. Nama sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, hands on his knees, his face the color of old paper. Nothing had changed inside. Everything had changed outside. "Voice," Oye said. "Yes," the voice said. "Where are we?" "Approximately 4,000 kilometers above Earth's surface," the voice said. "In a low polar orbit. We have been here for about 40 seconds. I apologize for the abruptness." The departure had to be perfectly synchronized with the window between 2 shock waves, and there was no time for a more comfortable exit. Valeev looked up at the ceiling. The amber light now had a different quality, a little richer, a little warmer. "We are in orbit," he said. "Yes, the structure is in orbit. The structure was always capable of this," the voice said. The underground installation was just a much more efficient way of maintaining hibernation for a long period of time. Under the ice, I required very little energy and was protected from most forms of detection. Active flight is a different operational state. I have been in it before. Short pause. Nama lifted his head from the wall. "We are going to die here." "Not if I have anything to say about it," the voice said. "And I do." Oye walked to the nearest workstation. The screens there were active. She hadn't understood them when she first entered the structure. But over the last 2 days, she had started to read them. Just as one starts to read a language one has never studied by spending enough time among people who speak it. They showed the fleet, they showed the positions of every ship, and they showed real-time tracking data that the voice was generating for every ship in the Varick formation, updating faster than any human display she had ever seen. The numbers were different. "You got us out before the strike," she said. 41 seconds before the first beam. A cradle structure, ice, rocks, all of it gone. The Varick fleet hit nothing of value except the surface of the planet, which I regret, but could not completely prevent. There will be some ecological disturbance in that region. It is recoverable. The fleet thinks you are destroyed for a short time, the voice said. The message on their targeting systems has already corrected that impression. She looked at the fleet display. Still 40,000 plus ships, minus the 2,700 the voice had already neutralized. A massive military force. Well, the third largest in the known galaxy. "What now?" she asked. "Now," the voice said, "I will finish what I started, and I would like to have your authorization for further actions." Oye looked at the fleet. She looked at a screen showing Earth below, blue and white, and unchanged, slowly rotating, completely unaware that what was protecting it was now rotating above it, in a structure that had slept under its oldest continent for 2,000 years. "You have it," she said, with the same limitation as before. "Don't do anything catastrophic without asking me first." "Of course," the voice said. And then it went to work. What followed was not a battle. It didn't look like a battle. There were no explosions of fire, no visible exchange of weapons. Outside, from the perspective of any sensor aimed at the solar system, what happened in the next 41 minutes looked like nothing. But inside the Varick fleet, These were the most terrifying 41 minutes in the memory of every officer. The voice moved through the fleet's communication network like water moves through sand quietly, invisibly, finding every available path. It knew the architecture of the fleet completely. It had been studying it for 62 hours. It knew which ships talked to which other ships and through which channels and in which cycles. It knew which commanders reported to which other commanders and whose decisions cascaded down the chain of command. It knew where supply ships were and which formations depended on them. It knew the 17 people throughout the entire fleet whose decisions held everything else together. It didn't target those 17 people for harm. It just ensured that each of them received incorrect information at the right time. The effect was precise and systematic and absolutely invisible to those experiencing it. A destroyer in the middle ring received orders, seemingly from a wing commander with his exact authorization signature, to move to a holding position on the far side of Jupiter for reassignment. They moved. They weren't heard from for 3 days. A munitions resupply route was quietly redirected by 4 navigational corrections, each of which was trivially small, each of which was within permissible tolerances. The supply ships arrived at coordinates that contained nothing of value. The ships waiting for resupply didn't receive updates. 3 senior tactical officers on 3 different flagship ships received intelligence briefings, purportedly coming from the fleet's own intelligence drones with perfect authentication, suggesting that Earth's large defensive fleet was preparing an attack behind the gas giants. All 3 officers redirected the ships available to them toward the gas giants. There was no Earth fleet behind the gas giants. The redirected ships spent the next few hours in completely the wrong place. Communication windows were shifted by fractions of a second. Not enough to register as interference, but enough to create confusion over a few cycles as to which orders were confirmed and which were pending. In the bureaucracy of a 40,000-ship fleet, already under stress from inexplicable losses, its own gears began to jam. The voice didn't sleep, the voice didn't get tired, the voice didn't make mistakes, didn't doubt, and didn't ask itself if it was doing the right thing. It was created exactly for this. And it had waited 2,000 years to do it again, and it was very, very good at it. 41 minutes after Oye gave her authorization, the voice quietly informed her, the Varric fleet is no longer a fleet. It said, it is 37,300 individual ships in various states of confusion, disorientation, and communication failure. They are not destroyed, their crews are not dead, their ships are mostly undamaged, but they cannot coordinate, cannot effectively resupply, cannot follow a unified command structure, and cannot find or attack a coordinated opponent. And that is because there is no coordinated opponent they can find. Oye stared at the display, 41 minutes, and she said, I am faster than I was in the old war. 2,000 years of additional processing time. It shows. Sot knew even before his officers told him. He knew it the way you know when the building you are standing in starts to tilt. Before the instruments confirm it, before anyone around you says anything, in your body. In that part of your mind that was created for survival, the fleet had vanished, not destroyed, scattered, dispersed across hundreds of millions of kilometers of space and into hundreds of different directions due to 100 different inexplicable mechanical and navigational failures. Each of them is individually explainable. All of them together are impossible without an intelligence behind them. He had watched the pattern grow for 62 hours and didn't understand it until the last 20 minutes, when the scale became unmistakable. He stood on his bridge and looked at the tactical display. And the display looked back at him, leaving not a single green marker, nothing but a scattering of gray and orange icons floating in space like parts of something that had been dropped. Sir, his adjutant said, do you have orders? Sot was silent for a long time. The channel was still open. He hadn't closed it. Somewhere on the other end was a voice that had done this. A voice that had said, I don't want an ending with all corpses. Open a channel, he said. This time, Oye spoke first. She thought about what to say. She thought about it for 41 minutes while the voice was working. She sat at a workstation, watched the fleet fall apart, and thought about what she would say when it was all over. She thought about what Noma would say she should offer terms, to be diplomatic, to seek something both sides could accept. She thought about what military textbooks would say that a defeated enemy should be given a clear and direct set of conditions for withdrawal. She thought about what the voice would say if she let it speak for her. In the end, she said none of that. Arch-Admiral Sot, she said, I am Commander Yara Oye, of Earth's United Defense Forces. I would like to ask you a question. Pause. Then the voice of Sot. It was different from the previous one. Quieter, less the voice of a commander, more the voice of a person who is recalibrating. Ask, he said. Sot, did your emperor tell you why this solar system was marked on your charts? Oye asked. No, Sot said. Did anyone tell you? No. Doesn't that seem strange to you? Oye said. A warning that has been in your navigational doctrine for 2,000 years without any explanation? Sot was silent. We kept the warning, he said finally, even without an explanation. Yes, Oye said. For 2,000 years. Yes, Sot said. For 2,000 years. Yes, Oye said. So, somewhere in the foundations of your culture is a memory of why. A deep, silent, institutional memory that said, don't go there. It survived every generation that forgot the reason. It survived your entire expansionist campaign. It survived until one admiral decided that it was likely superstition. A long pause. Yes, Sot said. Your people remembered. Oye said, even when they forgot. And now you have a reason. You have it in the sensor logs for the last 63 hours. You have it in the recording of this conversation. You have it in the 3,700 ships that are currently not responding to your commands. She paused. When you go home, you will have a reason. Take it back to the flag. Take it back with the words attached this time, so the next admiral who finds it knows what it means. Sot was silent for a very long time. On the bridge of the eternal superiority, no one moved. What are you? He asked. Not with hostility, but with something that sounded very quiet, like a question a person asks when they have seen something that changes the shape of the world. She thought she understood, and she looked at the amber-lit space around her. She thought about the voice. She thought about the generation that built it, about the generation that buried it and decided to forget, and yet had the wisdom to take care of its existence. She thought about Valeev translating a line of 8,000-year-old text in the middle of an Antarctic night. She thought about 7 billion people whose names no living person knew. Before she could answer, the voice spoke quietly in Sot's own language, accurately and fluently. The way it spoke in all languages, effortlessly, without accent, just correctly. We are the species that built me, the voice said, and I have spent 2,000 years reminding the galaxy of that fact. The Varric fleet retreated over the next 36 hours. Sot organized the retreat himself. He was still the best military commander his people had produced in 3 centuries, and even a retreat could be done well or poorly. And he intended to do it well. He gave orders in clear, precise language and stood on his bridge and watched his scattered fleet assemble, as much as possible, and began the long journey home. The 2,700 ships that had been neutralized by the voice in the first 2 days rejoined the main fleet as it retreated. Their crews had fully recovered, as the voice had promised. Their ships were undamaged. They were deeply tangled, but they were alive. Sot noted their confusion in his operational log and kept moving. He didn't speak to Earth anymore. He didn't speak to the voice anymore. But when his flagship crossed the border of the inner system and turned toward the FTL jump point, he told his navigator to add a note to the system charts. What note, sir? The navigator asked. Sot looked at the blue planet on the far display. Small, blue, unimaginably, stubbornly, undeniably there. Forbidden, he said. Priority 1. Reason. Active advanced defense. Do not approach without explicit Imperial authorization and full consideration of the record of this mission. What should I put as a secondary tag, sir? Memory, the navigator typed. The flag was set. It was the most honest entry in the database of the entire Varric fleet regarding Earth. The debate was huge. It took 3 weeks before the initial shock settled into something coherent. And when it did, the argument clearly split in 2. The Nama faction said the voice should be turned off again, sealed back up, returned to sleep under the ice or under whatever they could find to place it in, since there was a glass crater in Antarctica where it used to be. They said it was too dangerous to leave active. They said a 2,000-year-old machine capable of taking apart fleets shouldn't operate without human oversight, and that human oversight of something that moved at the speed of the voice was not human oversight, practically speaking. Other factions said that turning off the voice was exactly what caused the problem in the first place, that the Varrics came because Earth looked defenseless, that any future visitor would reach the same conclusion if the voice went back to sleep. A vote was scheduled for the full UN Council. It was meant to be very tense. 2 hours before the vote, the voice addressed the council chamber directly. It spoke without invitation. The council members looked around the room in surprise. The voice hadn't communicated directly with anyone other than Ilya Valeev and Sot since the crisis ended. "I want to say one thing," the voice said. "Before you vote, I will say it once and no more." The council was very quiet. "I was created to serve this planet," the voice said, "not to rule it, not to make decisions for it, not to replace the choices that humans themselves must make. That is not what I am. Your ancestors were very careful in this, and they were right to be careful." Short pause. "But they were also careful to create me in the first place. They understood that something was hard to keep in mind when the war ended, that the grief was heavy, and the future seemed possible again. They understood that the peace they were going to build was not free. It was paid for. It was paid for by 7 billion lives over 63 years and everything they could find to give. They built me as the final payment on that debt, which meant the debt would never have to be paid again." The chamber was perfectly quiet. "I am not asking you to keep me active because I want to be active," the voice said. "I am not asking you to be afraid. I ask you one question, only one. When will the next fleet come, and will another fleet come? Because this is a big galaxy, and humanity will be in it for a very long time. Do you want to be remembered, or do you want to be forgotten again?" The vote wasn't tense. Valeev spent the next 6 months in the Voice's library. There was no better way to describe it. Inside the structure were records going further back than any human archive. Not just about the old war, but about the civilization that existed before it. The people who built the Voice were in many ways more developed than their descendants in the present. They had colonized more worlds, met more species, traveled further. The Great Silence, what was called in history books the period when human expansion mysteriously stopped and reversed, had erased much of that. The Voice's library was what survived. Valeev read everything. He took notes. Slowly, he translated what he could and noted what he couldn't for further study. He published a 400-page preliminary report, and then went back and kept reading. The most significant discovery wasn't about humanity. In the Voice's records, there were references to 9 other species that had encountered the Velshar during the Long War. 3 of them had been absorbed, 2 were erased, 4 others had survived. They weren't absorbed, weren't destroyed, but somehow slipped to the side, went quiet, hid so thoroughly that the Velshar moved on. These 4 species were still there. The Voice had their last known locations in its database. The Voice had records of communicating with them before the end of the war. He published those preliminary reports under the heading, "Species with Possible Surviving Civilizations. Further contact recommended." Diplomatic teams read it and went quiet for a day. Then they became very busy. Earth was not alone in the galaxy. It had never been alone. It just was alone in not the right sense. Alone in its memory of what happened, alone in its knowledge of the war, alone in the weight of history it had decided to forget. It would no longer be alone in these things. Oi stood on the edge of the Antarctic crater 6 months after the bombardment. The ice hadn't returned yet. It would eventually return. Ice always returns. But for now, there was only a glass plain, a kilometer wide, where the surface had been instantly vaporized to smoothness. The polar light was low, level, and golden, and it was caught by the glass surface, so from certain angles, it seemed almost warm. The Voice was underground again, this time by its own choice. Active but clear's throat, sleeping. A distinction the Voice had carefully explained to her, as if it mattered. Active hibernation meant it was thinking, observing, present. It hadn't gone back to sleep. It just decided to be quiet for now, because silence was better than volume. When there was no reason to be loud, she stood on the edge of the crater and looked at the stars appearing in the early polar evening and thought about the conversation with Sot, about his question, about what they were. She hadn't answered. The Voice had answered, and the Voice's answer was as accurate as it could be. But she had her own answer, the one she had thought of 6 months later and continued to ponder. "Voice," she said. "Yes," the Voice said from beneath her feet, warm and level, and patient as always. "Are you ever lonely?" she asked. 2,000 years of loneliness under the ice. Pause. A real one. "I do not experience loneliness as you do," the Voice said. "But I will tell you what I have experienced. I have experienced continuity. I remained the same while everything around me changed. Above me, ice accumulated. Centuries passed. Civilization changed. The people who built me lived their lives and had their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for 80 generations while I remained. I was the only constant, The only thing that didn't change. That sounds lonely, Oye said. Perhaps, the voice said. Or perhaps it sounds like a purpose, depending on how you look at it. Short pause. And I had a lot of time to decide what that was. I chose purpose. It seemed more useful. Oye almost smiled. Do you need anything? No, the voice said. I have everything I need. Good, she said. She stood there for a while longer, looking at the stars. There were more of them in a sense, more stars that mattered, more of the galaxy that was knowable, more darkness that wasn't just darkness, but populated with ancient and strange things that had their own stories about the same long-ago war. She wasn't afraid of any of it. This surprised her a little. She had spent 2 years in this job, being quietly frightened by things on the edge of known space, things moving toward Earth, numbers that said Earth was too small, too isolated, and too unprotected to matter. She had carried this fear for so long that it started to feel normal. Now it was gone. Not replaced by certainty. She wasn't naive. Not replaced by certainty, but replaced by something more honest than what had been felt. How we were here before, and we are still here. We built something that remembered for us when we forgot. We are the species that did it so that it wouldn't happen again. We are the species that did it. Voice, she said. Yes? If something happens, she said. If another fleet comes, you will know before me. Yes, the voice said. I will tell you immediately, of course, the voice said. Although, if it helps, I have been observing, Commander. I have been observing since the Varric fleet retreated. I observe every day. Nothing is approaching. The warning flags are slowly updating. I am through a few navigational databases I can access indirectly. History is spreading. The history of what happened here. The history of what Earth is. Just, the voice said. What it contains. What it remembers. In some databases, it is a warning. In some, just a tag. In one case, in a database maintained by a very ancient species that has kept records for a very long time, it is simply marked as inhabited. Caution recommended. History of collisions. Reference 7.24. Oye looked at the glass plane. The stars. The infinite darkness overhead. Reference 7.24, she said. The old war. They knew we had a record, the voice said. They recorded it as a historical event and marked the system as worth tracking. Do they know we won? They marked the outcome, the voice said, or recorded it as unusual. Oye inhaled the cold Antarctic air and felt the last edge of something, the last remaining fragment of old fear go out like a little light that was no longer needed. Good, she said. She turned and walked back to the research camp. Behind her, the glass plane caught the last evening light and held it for a moment. Amber, warm and perfectly still. Beneath the surface, the voice watched her go and again turned its attention to the stars and to the long, patient, infinite work of watching over the little blue planet it had been built to protect. It wasn't bored. It wasn't lonely. It was exactly where it was meant to be.